True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Rozanne Gailiunas was smart, caring, and a very devoted parent. In 1983, her marriage to physician Peter was on the rocks. She was in love with contractor Larry Aylor, a man also in the middle of a contentious divorce. In fact, the two were making plans to spend the rest of their lives together. Then, a little past 6 p.m. on October 4th of 1983, police found Rozanne murdered in her suburban home. She was bound, nude, and face down on her bed. Her 4-year-old son was in the home. Thankfully, he was unharmed. Rozanne's husband, Peter, and her lover, Larry, were the first people that police wanted to speak with. Rozanne appeared to have been sexually assaulted, and there were no signs of a burglary. Her husband, Peter, seemed to have the strongest motive, but then Peter pointed the finger at Larry or his wife, Joy. All three had an alibi. Join us at the quiet end for Murder on Her Mind. The events leading up to the murder of Rozanne and the events that followed her death really make up a complex web of lust, hatred, and greed. It would take years for police to solve the case. When the truth was finally exposed, it shocked an entire community, and dare I say, an entire country. So what have we got for a beer today, Dick? We're back in Texas. We go there a lot of murdering going on there apparently.
We're in Texas, and we're reviewing a beer called 512 IPA, which is brewed by the 512 Brewing Company in Austin. I think that's the area code for Austin, 512.
Well, it better be, because they have the parentheses around it as if it's an area code.
Yeah. So, and I also, when I was looking through my notes on this, I think this was the first trip you and I took together before we even got married.
Whoa.
And we visited my daughter and her dumbass husband.
Ex-husband now.
Now ex. So, it was a good beer. Did I say it's an American IPA? If I didn't, it is.
Okay.
It's a hazy amber color with a big, fat, huge off-white head, a lot of lacing to the glass, aroma of citrus, a little bit of pine, and some sweet malt. The taste, grapefruit, orange, pine, and caramel.
Now, how hoppy is it? Is there some kind of hoppy level that you beer people come up with, or you just have to kind of do that subjectively?
Both. There's a thing called IBU, International Bitterness Unit, or Bittering Unit. The higher that number is, the more hoppy it is. So I don't know exactly what this one is, but this is a fairly balanced beer. It's not a big hoppy beer. So there's kind of an equal amount of caramel and hops. It won't offend you.
I don't think I've ever been offended by a beer. By some people who have served me beer and people who have drank beer with me, but never by the beer itself.
Okay, so this beer will be innocent.
Yes.
And you'll like it.
I think so. You know, when I'm in the mood for an IPA, I really enjoy the hops.
Yeah, well, this one you'll enjoy without a lot of hops.
Great. All right, let's open it. Here I sit at the quiet end for another day. A little bit lonely, so come on over.
Okay.
Now, who recommended this one? Because I know someone recommended this amazing case. Holy shit.
We did have a recommendation. It was from a lady named Ashlyn, who recommended this months ago.
Well, it takes us a while to get to these.
Yeah.
But this is fascinating and convoluted, twisty-turny.
Yeah, it was an excellent case.
It really is a fascinating story to listen to. All right, well, cuddle up here with me and start telling this story, because there's a lot to talk about.
There sure is. It's going to start out fairly straightforward, but it gets very convoluted.
Yes, yep.
So Rozanne met her future husband, Peter Gailiunas, in November of 1977. They were both working in an intensive care unit at a Boston hospital. Peter was a nephrologist, kidney specialist, but he was working shifts in the emergency room by his admission so that he could meet women.
Red flag?
I guess so.
Maybe.
And Rozanne was an RN. She was 27 and he was 30. According to Peter, he and Rozanne were very attracted to each other right away. But Peter was dating another woman at the time, and Rozanne was married to someone at that time. But after they met and the right signals were going back and forth between them, Peter quickly ended his relationship with the other woman, and Rozanne filed for a divorce from her husband. And within 3 or 4 months, they had decided to move to Dallas, get married, and have a family.
Well, Rozanne had trouble adapting, though, to the heat and humidity in Dallas.
Oh, God, no kidding.
It's tough, but she did love her nursing job at Parkland Hospital. Within 3 months of moving, she was pregnant, and their son, Peter Jr., who they would call Little Peter, was born 6 weeks prematurely in 1979. Peter encouraged Rozanne to quit her job and stay home with their little boy, and she did, but she really wasn't happy being at home full-time. She certainly loved her son, but staying home just was kind of boring and not challenging for her. She had really enjoyed being a nurse. So, let's talk about Joy Aylor.
Yeah, there's more than 2 protagonists in this story.
There's a lot of people involved.
Yeah.
So we have Peter and Rozanne, and now we're going to talk about Joy and her husband Larry, because these 2 couples intersect.
Yes, they do. So Joy Aylor was 30 years old in 1979. She was the daughter of a wealthy man named Henry Davis, and he owned a successful construction business. By the time Joy married Larry Aylor, her father had a net worth of over $15 million, and his company was building up to 25 houses at a time.
So that's really rich, yeah.
Joy had 2 sisters, Carol and Elizabeth. Joy and Carol were just 2 years apart, and in many ways they became rivals of each other. Joy always felt that Carol was her mother's favorite, and that Carol always got more from her parents.
So Carol was the Marcia, if you'll let me go with a Brady Bunch reference. Carol, Carol, Carol.
You
right?
got it.
Yeah. So Joy married Larry in 1968, and that was just 1 week after she'd turned 19. Larry was a guy from Virginia, and he had moved to Dallas with his parents and his 3 sisters when he was just 9 years old. Larry adjusted well to life in Dallas, and as a teen he worked jobs bagging groceries and pumping gas, so he wasn't afraid to work. Larry met Joy when she was a sophomore in high school and he was a junior, and after Larry graduated from high school, his family returned to Virginia. That summer he joined them and worked on a building crew at the University of Virginia. Then in the fall he moved back to Texas and enrolled in college. He did continue to see Joy, and they did end up getting married about 3 years later. In 1970, Joy gave birth to their only child, Christopher. So according to Larry, Joy was really an excellent mom. She stayed home and devoted herself to their young son, but as time went on, she became more distant with Larry. Sex became infrequent, and Larry wondered if Joy was maybe seeing another man. In fact, he went to Joy's dad and said, "I don't know what to do. She's just not interested in sleeping with me," which was a brave thing to say.
And what did Dad say?
And Dad said, "Well, if she's not getting it from you, she's getting it from someone."
Attaboy, Dad.
So that's Dad's advice. But Larry left college before graduating, and he worked several jobs. All of them he hated. Then he went back and spoke to his father-in-law about becoming involved in the construction business, because his father-in-law is a bit of a tycoon.
Yeah. You could look at him and figure, I want to make some money like he's doing.
Exactly. And his father-in-law told Larry, "Well, you need to work in the business for a while, and then I'll help you get your start," so that Larry could start his own contracting business.
Yeah, so he ended up getting a loan to build his first house, but he made a good profit on the house, and he soon developed a reputation for building really quality homes. And Joy began to work alongside him, designing the interiors. So within a few years, Larry and Joy were wealthy people. Joy wore a Rolex, and she drove a red Porsche. Larry drove a Jag. He also owned a boat, a motorcycle, a pickup truck, and some four-wheel drive vehicles.
Yeah, a lot of guys really like their motorized toys, don't they?
Yeah, well, look at all the ones I have.
Yeah, not really, no. So the business did well, but Larry and Joy weren't doing well. Joy's parents were really kind of overbearing, and Chris, their son, was expected to live with them as they provided him with gifts. Larry argued against this. He didn't think that was a good idea.
I'm a little mystified by that. Is that like a stipulation? We'll give you money and stuff if you live with us? He's their grandson, not their son.
I know. It's really bizarre because it's not like Larry and Joy didn't have any money.
Right.
It was kind of a controlling thing, I suppose. I don't know. But it was weird, and Larry didn't like it. But he was just outvoted by Joy and her parents. They were controlling that. So Larry felt like Joy was distant, and Joy felt like maybe Larry was cheating on her. Larry was also concerned that their son Chris was being manipulated by Joy's family. Joy's sister Carol had some mental health issues that resulted in some psychiatric hospital admissions. Her husband left her, and then she began stalking her husband, and Joy's parents felt like they had to take in Carol's only daughter and raise her themselves. So these parents are just hyper-controlling, I suppose.
I guess.
Yeah. And it's nice that they took in Carol's daughter, but I just wonder, was that necessary?
Yeah, and then what kinds of information is his daughter getting?
Exactly.
From the grandparents.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So when Larry first met Rozanne Gailiunas in 1982, his marriage wasn't doing very well at all. Joy was paying more attention to her appearance. She had gotten breast implants, and she was dressing rather provocatively, at least according to Larry. And the couple spent hardly any time together. At the same time, Rozanne and Peter were in a similar situation. So we've got two marriages on the rocks here.
Yeah, they're both kind of dissolving at the same time. So it was December 1982 when Joy gave Larry a message that a doctor had called about him building him a house. And days later, Larry drove to the home of Peter and Rozanne, which was located in north central Dallas. When he knocked on the door, Rozanne answered. And according to Larry, she was the most beautiful woman he had ever met. She had a gorgeous smile, thick dark hair, and big brown eyes.
So Rozanne led Larry into the den to wait for Peter. Peter took a fairly long time to come in and greet him, and that gave Larry the impression that Peter was a bit of a snob or a control freak, or both. When Peter walked into the room, he introduced himself to Larry, poured himself a drink from the wet bar, but didn't offer a drink to Larry.
Yeah.
Now, come on, that's just common courtesy.
That's really rude and snotty, isn't it?
It is. And Peter also didn't have the gift of gab that Larry had gotten accustomed to with people in Texas. He's from Boston, so Peter would get right to the point. He wanted to build a new house for his family. He had gotten Larry's contact information off a sign in front of one of his houses that he had built. Peter had been impressed with the workmanship, and he wanted to hire Larry as his contractor.
Yeah, so they discussed the prospective project, and then Peter called in Rozanne to be part of the conversation. When she came into the den, she looked uninterested, but in the end, Larry agreed to take on the project. So as they were discussing the prospective project, Peter called in Rozanne to be part of the conversation. When she came into the den, she looked uninterested, though. In the end, Larry did decide to take on the project, but before he left, he explained that his wife, Joy, worked with him, and she designed the interior of his homes. Peter was agreeable to that, but then he said he wanted Rozanne to be as involved as possible in the new house. He said that ever since she had left her nursing career, she had been bored and depressed, and Peter thought the project might cheer her up and give her a purpose. So I guess that's an okay thing for him to do. It seems a bit patronizing.
It really does.
Yeah, but, I guess he was trying to help.
Yeah, probably, and at least in his own way.
Yeah, but, Larry was thrilled to have Rozanne involved. He liked her.
Yeah, he did. He already had a bit of a crush on her. Now, initially, he didn't have any plans to begin an affair with Rozanne, but it didn't take long for them to become interested in each other in a romantic sense.
Yeah, that's true. Pretty quickly, actually.
Yeah, so I'm thinking that he wasn't at all unhappy to have Rozanne involved, because that would mean that she's closer to him and he could work on her.
Yep, so he broke ground for their new house in January of 1983, and Larry kept in contact with Rozanne. But he could see that she just didn't seem invested in this new house, which was weird because it was going to be gorgeous. But that spring, Larry took her to lunch, and while they were eating, Larry asked her what was wrong, and she began to kind of quietly cry. She admitted that she really didn't want this house to be built. She and Peter, she said, were having marital problems, and as soon as the house was finished, she was leaving him, she said. So that was a bit surprising, although this news was probably like music to Larry's ears. He was definitely interested in her. Then he confided in her about his own marital problems, and he told her that he and Joy were also talking about a divorce. And after that, the two just confided in each other on a regular basis, and of course they became involved romantically. They snuck off for lovemaking as often as they could, and they had secret telephone calls just about every day, hot and heavy right off.
That June, Larry moved out of the house he shared with Joy and rented an apartment. Joy seemed upset initially, but within a few days, she found a boyfriend of her own. So he was a plumbing contractor named Jody Packer. We'll hear more about him later. Larry filed for the divorce, and less than a week later, Rozanne left Peter. She took Peter Jr. with her, who was now 4 years old, and she rented a 3-bedroom house. She quickly filed for a divorce, using the same attorney that Larry was using. Then she took a nursing job in a pediatrician's office.
Yes, I get the impression here that Peter was kind of discouraging her from working outside of the home, because as soon as she breaks it off with him, she's out working.
Well, she liked to work. She enjoyed being a nurse.
Yeah, but I think her husband Peter didn't want her to work.
Oh, yeah. I think that's true.
And of course, Peter soon knew that Rozanne had a new man in her life. But at first he didn't know it was Larry. He hired a private investigator to follow Rozanne, and then he reported to Peter that Rozanne's lover was Larry Aylor. Rozanne told Larry that Peter was harassing her. They had a confrontation one night when she went to pick up Peter Jr. at his house after a visit. And she said that before she could get to the door to leave, they had a pretty intense argument. She was leading little Peter, as she called her son, out of the house when Peter grabbed the child's arm. And after she demanded that he let the child go, Peter ran into another room and returned with a gun. "If you try to take my son away, I will shoot you," he said. Then there was another time he reached for a syringe, and he told her that this was a deadly drug, and if she didn't stay with him, he would inject it into his arm. But Rozanne didn't believe him. She actually made a joke about it, which probably really made him mad.
Probably.
So he didn't get the reaction he was hoping for at all.
Now, did she go to the police about this?
I don't believe so. This is Texas. This stuff happens.
Huh, okay.
I'm just joking. I don't know. There's no report of her going to the police at that point.
Yeah, the gun, certainly.
Yeah,
I'm
it's
picking
scary.
up my son. Husband comes out and says, "If you try to take my son away, I'll shoot you." I think I'd have to make a call to the police.
I don't think she took him as seriously as maybe she should have.
Apparently.
So that same summer, Larry told a friend that he was getting harassing phone calls from Joy. One evening, Dr. Peter and his mother showed up at Larry's door. Peter told Larry that he wanted him to stop seeing his wife, and Peter's mother was just standing there by his side, so that was kind of odd. Why do you take your mother with you? Would you? I don't know. That seems unusual.
Well, I don't think I would.
But Larry told them to leave and to work things out himself with Rozanne. You know, like, why are you talking to me about this?
Yeah, it's and your wife that need to deal with this.
Yeah, it's totally reasonable. So Peter and his mom left, without incident, kind of with his tail between his legs. But not happy, that's for sure.
Not at all.
But Larry and Rozanne seemed to have fallen pretty deeply in love. That autumn, Larry's friends said they really had never seen him happier. Rozanne's friends and family said the same thing about her. Then in early October, Rozanne called her sister and told her that she had met a wonderful man who really cared about her. So she was really happy to be with Larry.
Yeah, and to keep the peace as much as possible, Rozanne tried to be accommodating with sharing custody of little Peter. Big Peter had the boy Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings, and as well as dinners nearly every evening. Rozanne was seeing Larry at least 4 nights a week, but there still were some problems with this arrangement.
Certainly.
So September 28th, while little Peter was with his dad, Rozanne spent the night at Larry's. And when she got to her rental house the next morning, someone had broken in. A window had been broken in the kitchen. There wasn't anything missing except for a key to the back door. So Rozanne called a locksmith and she had deadbolts put on the doors.
Well, that was smart. Then on October 3rd, Rozanne was having dinner with Larry, and she returned home about 6 p.m. and talked on the phone with him again twice before going to bed. She promised to stop by and see him the next morning before she was picking up little Peter from his father's house. So Tuesday, October 4th, Rozanne left Larry's at 11:15 after seeing him that morning, and Larry went to work. She told him that she would see him around 6 o'clock that evening after she dropped little Peter back at his father's for dinner. So Larry went back to his apartment at noontime, and there was a message from Rozanne on his answering machine. She said that she was taking little Peter out to lunch, and then they were going to his ice skating class. She said they would be back by mid-afternoon, and before she hung up, she added, "Remember that I love you."
Oh, you're foreshadowing things here. Remember that I love you. Remember that I'll always love you, or you'll be in my heart forever, and they never hear from him again.
Yeah, that's true.
So at 3 o'clock, Larry tried calling Rozanne but got no answer. He tried again several times and still got no answer. And about 4:30, he called his sister Karen and asked her if she had heard anything from Rozanne. She hadn't either, and she offered to go with Larry to look for her. Larry was concerned because Rozanne had had a flat tire earlier, and he was worried that she had another car mishap or something.
Sure. So Larry picked up his sister Karen, and what they were going to do was retrace Rozanne's normal routes to see if she was stranded on the road somewhere. But there was some pretty heavy rush hour traffic, and that nixed the plan. Larry then decided he was probably just overreacting. He went home and waited to hear back from her. But once he was home, he felt restless, so he decided to go out for a bike ride. And while he was bicycling in his neighborhood, a large car came up behind him and actually hit him into a ditch. He didn't get a look at the driver, though. But Larry was bleeding from many small cuts and abrasions from the fall. He walked his bike home and cleaned his wounds. Then he tried calling Rozanne again. This time little Peter answered, and he told Larry that his mother was bad sick. Then Larry heard a male voice telling the child to hang up. "Hang up the goddamn phone," I think was the phrase. So this was alarming, especially after all Rozanne had told him about her husband possibly stalking her. But he couldn't be sure that the man's voice in the background was Peter's voice. Still, he was pretty alarmed by this.
I would be. Paramedics Glenn Moore and Winfred Duggan received a call at 6:33 p.m. to see to a sick woman at Rozanne's rental house. So they're thinking, some old lady fell down and she's not able to get up, that type of thing. The house where Rozanne was renting was white, set back from the road, with a neat lawn and gardens. Typical Dallas suburb. Paramedics arrived at the house at 6:36. When they got there, the front door was ajar. When they went inside, they saw little Peter sitting on the couch, eating a bowl of cereal and watching TV. The child was startled. When they came in, he yelled at him, "What are you doing here? Get out. My daddy doesn't want you here. He'll beat you up. He'll tear your heads off."
So that's kind of funny that little kid would say that, huh?
Yeah, isn't it?
Yeah. But everything looked normal in the house. The only thing was this kid's there with no adults. They ignored the child's comments and walked down the hallway. And then they heard moaning and some wet, uneven breathing, so that was worrisome. At the entrance of the master bedroom, they were confronted with just this horrible sight. A young nude woman with long dark hair was sprawled across the bed on her stomach. Her legs and her right arm were tied to 3 posts of the bed, holding her into a spread eagle position. There was a stocking and some cloth twisted around her throat. A blood-stained pillow covered most of her head, which was hanging over the edge of the bed. And below there on the carpet, there was a puddle that was blood mixed with vomit. Rozanne was still alive, and as she breathed, she made this rattling, gasping sound. She had a steady pulse, but her head was so matted with blood, it almost looked like she was wearing a big red helmet, was how one of them described it. The paramedics cautiously probed her head for injuries, and they found 2 small bullet entry holes, one in the back and another over the temple. She had been shot and strangled. So as the cord on her neck was unwrapped, her breathing didn't become any easier, and they noticed something yellow hanging from the corner of her mouth. When they pried open her mouth, they found a big wad of yellow facial tissue. And they were able to extract a lot of it, but there was still some stuck down her throat, which they actually had to remove with a pair of forceps so that she could breathe. Her limbs were released from the ropes that held them to the bedposts, and they kept the knots intact as evidence of the crime. An IV was started before she was put on a gurney to be transferred to the hospital. And as they exited the front door, little Peter followed them. A police car came up the driveway then. An officer watched over little Peter while the paramedics rushed his mother to get medical help. And more police arrived and began searching the house, and then a group of them were canvassing the neighborhood.
Yeah, and as all this is going on, Dr. Peter arrives with his mother. Does he go anywhere without his mom?
I think so.
Peter introduced himself as Rozanne's husband. He requested that his mother be allowed to take little Peter home with her. Investigators had already determined that little Peter had been asleep in his room when his mother was attacked. Peter Sr. accompanied a detective to the station for questioning.
So just hold the phone a second here. I think 4 years old, he might remember some stuff, and maybe he shouldn't have gone home with his grandma.
I think it'd be a good idea to talk to him.
I think they needed an expert to talk with him, yeah.
Yeah, and not just a cop, a psychologist who's interviewed kids.
Yeah, someone who's, skilled at that. Because he was very verbal, a bright kid, he probably could have given them some information. But after Peter had left with the detective, Larry Aylor showed up with his father, and he introduced himself as Rozanne's boyfriend, which was a big surprise to the investigators because Peter hadn't mentioned that he and Rozanne were separated. Rozanne's ambulance arrived at the ER at 7:10 p.m. Her pulse and respirations were regular and strong, and they determined that she had been shot twice in the head, but the temple wound hadn't entered the head deeply. A nurse was able to grab it with some tweezers and pull it from just below the skin's surface. The second bullet was inside Rozanne's brain, though, so she had to be prepared for emergency surgery. It was 7:40 p.m. when she was x-rayed and ventilated. At 7:43, the on-call neurosurgeon showed up to perform the operation. So at 7:55, Rozanne's head was CAT scanned to see where the bullet was, and also to estimate the extent of brain damage. Pretty dire circumstances.
As it's going to turn out, yes. Meanwhile, Peter Gailiunas had stopped talking while he waited for his attorney to arrive. This didn't surprise the detectives. It had kind of become predictable for a person involved in a violent crime to want his attorney present at questioning.
Well, it's common sense, really.
It really is. In fact, the need for an attorney seemed to grow in direct proportion to a person's level of education.
So, as a doctor, they weren't surprised at all that he would know his rights and speak up immediately.
Sure.
But now Larry was eager to cooperate. Once he was at the police station, he was looked at with suspicion. The detective questioned him about his scratches. The ones that had come from his bike accident he had earlier that day.
Yeah.
And he was asked outright if he was the attacker. And Larry called an attorney right then.
Good idea.
So both of them are being pretty cautious.
Yeah, so while the Peter and Larry are waiting for their attorneys to show up, Rozanne was in surgery. And her injury to her brain was pretty grave. The bullet that had been fired into the back of her head had pretty much hit the worst possible spot, so it would cause severe damage. It had entered the parietal region of her skull on the right side. So the parietal region is the side of the head or the brain. The bullet had moved down and diagonally through her brain, stopping just behind her left eye. So it did a lot of damage. Traveled from the right side of her head down to behind her left eye. And obviously as it travels through the brain, It's hot, so it's cooking the tissue that it's gone through, and it's turning these portions of her brain into dead tissue.
Yeah, which is obvious, but I never really thought of it that way, that it would do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not just the path of the bullet.
Exactly. So that really explains a lot about head wounds and head injuries.
Yeah. And this one, this is going to go through a lot of vital parts of the brain.
Yeah. Really not salvageable at all.
No, she had a horrendous prognosis and probably wasn't going to survive much longer. So he was unable to do any more. The surgeon worked as best he could to remove pieces of bone, hair, and skin from the brain. Her surgery was completed by 11 p.m. She was alive, but she was brain dead. So she had machines to keep her body alive, but she was in an irreversible vegetative state. Jill, what did you put in the blender?
My Bluetooth earbuds. If I hear another piece of shit commercial, I'm going to scream.
That's a little extreme, don't you think? I can't help you with other podcasts, but all of our True Crime Brewery episodes now come with commercial-free versions for our Tie Grabber subscribers.
Well, I know. My hate for ads is what motivated me to give Tie Grabber members that ad-free option. If you subscribe at tiegrabber.com, you get to listen to all of our new episodes commercial-free, and this is in addition to our bonus episodes every month. Plus, you get some great TCB swag mailed to you when you join.
Okay, I get it. At least TCB listeners can avoid ads. Just turn off the damn blender. You're going to wake up the whole neighborhood.
Okay, I'm sorry for swearing.
Not a fucking problem.
So meanwhile, back in her neighborhood, officers were going door to door to see if anyone had seen anything unusual. The officers searching the house found very little evidence, though. No fingerprints, shoe prints, or any real visible clues. The blood they found all belonged to Rozanne, it would turn out. So the only clues were a shell casing on her pillow and, of course, the rope on the bedposts. Also, no one in the neighborhood reported seeing anyone entering or leaving her house that day. There were 2 neighbor girls who said they had seen little Peter playing in front of the house that afternoon, at 3:45 and then again at 5:20. He'd been out alone, and according to the neighbors, Rozanne never let him play outside unsupervised, so this was very unusual.
Yeah, you would think probably that's the time when she was being attacked.
Yeah.
Or at least some of those times.
Well, they said he was asleep while she was being attacked. So maybe it was before and after the attack. Not sure. I have some questions about the whole thing that I'll bring up with you later that we can go over.
Okay. And after Peter's lawyer arrived, Peter told the detectives that he'd been at home in the evening waiting for Rozanne to bring his son to his house for dinner. At 6:15, though, little Peter called and said his mother was sick. So after he got that call, Peter asked his mother to call the paramedics. So Peter denied being at Rozanne's house that afternoon. He said that he had been afraid something like this might happen ever since his wife moved out. And then when asked who he thought was responsible, he said it would have been either Larry Aylor or his wife Joy.
So this is something important which was kind of ignored. Because I think Dr. Peter had the right idea here.
He did. He just didn't go far enough.
Yeah. Well, Larry's lawyer didn't stay with him, so that was kind of a shitty lawyer. He said that Larry was innocent and he should just go ahead and talk to the detectives.
Yeah, I can't believe that.
It was bad.
Yeah,
and that's after Larry gave him a check for $1,500.
I hope he got his money back.
Yeah, well, Larry explained to the detectives about his plans to meet Rozanne that evening and how he had been unable to reach her by phone. He had finally gotten an answer, but it was little Peter who answered, and then he told them about the male voice who told him to hang up the phone. Investigators decided that they needed to speak with little Peter. Well, duh. I think they should have done that right off before sending him home with his grandma, because if his dad and grandma were involved in this, grandma could be filling his head with stuff.
She'll be telling him tales.
Yeah. So they asked Peter's mother, little Peter's grandmother, to bring him back to the station for questioning, and she argued and hesitated a little bit. but she finally did agree to do that. But he was only 4. He was hyperactive, and his attention span was not super long. Plus, they didn't really have the right kind of expert there to talk to him. A detective was able to get out of him that his mother had sent him for a nap that afternoon as a punishment for acting up at his ice skating class. He woke up later, he said, and found her sick in her room. He said she was tied up so she wouldn't fall in that stuff, apparently referring to the blood and vomit that was puddled on the floor beneath her head. So I don't know if that's just the way he interpreted it or if someone had told him that.
Yeah, I think it's probably the latter.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, when Big Peter asked Little Peter, who had told him to hang up the phone, he said, "You did." But then, when Big Peter repeated the question, Little Peter said, "Nobody." So in the end, the investigators decided that this child was not able to give them any valuable information. So they hadn't called in an expert in child interrogation, child psychology. So I really think they kind of fucked up there. I think they probably could have gotten some interesting stuff from a 4-year-old if they'd done it correctly.
They probably could have. And the lead detective didn't believe that Larry or Peter could have been the shooter. Well, I don't know. I'm thinking Peter could have been now, even though little Peter changed his story a little bit.
Yeah.
Initially, he placed his father there.
I know, right? So that's interesting.
Anyway.
But I guess just the way the crime looked, it didn't appear to be a crime of passion to them. So that's what they decided. If Rozanne had been attacked during an argument, they thought there'd be more signs of a struggle in the house, but there weren't any. And despite her being tied to the bed nude, they didn't find any further evidence of a sex crime. So they were starting to believe that the shooter was a stranger who just committed a random act of violence. And this would mean that there was a killer on the loose, and other people in the community could be at risk. But before they made any firm conclusions, they needed to verify alibis, interview people, re-interview people, and of course examine all of the evidence, although it was limited.
It was. On Thursday, October 6th, the case was officially a homicide. 2 days after Rozanne's surgery, brainwave tests showed no activity, and she was taken off life support. She never regained consciousness and was declared dead, just 33 years old.
So that's tragic if you just think about that for a second, with this little boy, too.
Yes, that's the tragedy.
Yeah.
The autopsy took place the next day, October 7th. No powder or tattooing were visualized, so the gun wasn't held close to her head. The bullet had perforated the skull and brain, lacerating the lining of the left frontal lobe, and that's what killed her. Second bullet wound caused a subscapular hemorrhage, but wasn't as serious. So this is the bullet that was sort of just plucked out by the nurse.
Yeah,
it hadn't really penetrated. The pathologist also noted that the strangulation attempt caused an additional lethal injury. And by that he meant that if Rozanne had not been shot in the back of her head, strangulation could have caused her death.
So as far as this case goes, opportunity was easy to check, as detectives verified the alibis of Peter, Larry, and Joy. The last person to see Rozanne before the shooting was actually the ice skating instructor, who said that she left with little Peter at 2:30 p.m. The call to the fire department was noted to have come in at 6:33, so there's a 4-hour gap there where we don't know what was happening. Whatever Rozanne was doing that afternoon, it did seem that she had been at home the whole time. Little Peter said they hadn't gone anywhere after ice skating, and that he'd been put down for a nap, so they just were thinking she had been home that whole time. So first they would try and find out where the rope came from, and then they would try to connect the bullets to a specific gun. But there were a lot of guns in the Dallas area. The alibis of Peter, Larry, and Joy, though, had checked out. Peter was at a clinic and then at his office. Larry was with his sister Karen, and Joy was with her parents at a cottage down by the lake.
That certainly doesn't preclude one of them from hiring somebody to do it.
Yeah, but I don't think that really occurred to them at this point.
Yeah, it might not. I mean, we're still in the early stages of investigation.
I would think murders for hire are much more rare.
Yeah.
But certainly a possibility, yeah. Can't rule it out.
Nope, can't do that. So Joy offered her condolences to Larry, telling him she knew how much Rozanne meant to him. Larry asked her, "Don't do anything to stop our divorce from going through." He said he was tired of the fighting. But Joy told him that she wanted him back. She wanted him to move back home. Chris needed his father, and she missed him. So he wasn't happy about this, but he did agree to try again. And for a while it looked like things might work out. Friends had seen them holding hands, hugging, kissing in public. Joy seemed happy. The business continued to do very well, and Larry bought Joy a Porsche for Christmas that year.
But Joy really resented, I think, how much Larry was still mourning Rozanne. He'd really been in love with her. He continued to take flowers to Rozanne's grave, and he talked about her a lot, even to Joy. And then things just began to fall apart again in that marriage. Joy became pregnant a couple of months after they had reconciled, and she decided to have an abortion. Then, in June of 1985, Joy filed for divorce.
And then in January 1986, Joy withdrew the divorce petition. But at this point, they're living separate lives. In June of 1986, Joy told Larry that they were broke, and he couldn't believe it. They had almost $200,000 in their bank account. But Joy said that there had been a lot of unexpected expenses, and they owed taxes now, and Joy had borrowed $30,000 from her father just to pay the household expenses. Something's fishy there.
Well, she did like to spend.
Apparently.
So a few days after telling Larry about these financial problems, Joy told Larry that she wanted to meet with him to have a, real deep talk about their marriage and their feelings. And she suggested that they meet at Larry's ranch in Kaufman County. Then she asked him if he would saddle up a couple of horses for her and her mother so they could go for a ride. Then after the ride, she and Larry could spend the evening having a talk. So this was an odd request. For one thing, Joy didn't ride horses, and neither did her mom.
That's a very odd request, then.
In fact, Joy had been so uninterested in the ranch that she needed directions to find it. Now, for me, I can't imagine having a ranch somewhere with horses and not going there. Right. It sounds like just a wonderful thing.
Well, and even if you're not into riding horses, just get out of the city, go to the ranch, unwind. Sounds nice.
It sounds like they had such a good life. That's why I can't understand this. But she asked Larry to draw her a detailed map out to the ranch. Yeah, so he did it.
He did. So then a few days later, Larry was on his way out to the ranch when he ran into an old friend. He stopped to chat with the guy and explained that he was going to saddle some horses for his wife and mother-in-law. And the friend laughed because he knew also that Joy was not a horse person. So then Larry invited his friend to come along. They could take the horses out for a run and tire them out before the women rode them. But hours later, after Larry and his friend had gone horseback riding, and they were back on the porch drinking bourbon and cokes, Joy and her mother still hadn't arrived. So as they drank and talked, Larry noticed a pickup truck driving down the road in front of the ranch. This was several times, so like it's kind of going back and forth.
Yeah, like it's kind of scoping the place out even.
Yeah. So finally he said, heck with this, and he decided to leave. He got into his truck with his friend sitting in the passenger seat. And he's still kind of pissed that Joy hadn't showed up. As they drove out of the ranch through the gate, the driver's side window shattered, and they heard gunshots. His friend was hit in his arm, and Larry told him, get down. He sped away until there were no more shots heard.
So Larry drove his friend to the nearest hospital, and he had a gunshot wound to his elbow. All Larry had was some window glass embedded in his back. After they got treatment, Larry decided to call Joy, and he reached her at her family's cottage on Cedar Creek Lake. But she was very cold. When he told her about the shooting, she said, well, whose wife are you screwing now? And that was weird because she'd been all like lovey and let's talk about our marriage.
Yeah.
And now she's like, well, of course I didn't show up. Just screw you.
Yeah, I know. And then he didn't call her out on why she hadn't shown up.
No, I think that Joy was kind of like that.
She made it clear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Larry's truck was examined, and the Kaufman County deputies found small bullet holes in the front of the truck. The shots had come from a .22 caliber rifle. So the police officers decided that the bullets had probably been fired accidentally by hunters in the area. Holy cow.
But listen, his lover has just been murdered, so why didn't they take this more seriously? They really didn't. And Larry really thought that someone was trying to kill him. He called the detective in charge of Rozanne's case, but that detective was doubtful too that the shooting had anything to do with Rozanne's murder. It had been 3 years since Rozanne's murder at this point, and detectives had already decided it was probably a random act. They thought it might have even been done by a serial killer. So they just told Larry to forget about it. Forget about it.
Yeah.
No big whoop.
You guys are alive, so don't worry.
Yeah.
And then 2 days after this, Larry learned that Joy had been having an affair with Jody Parker. Now, Parker was a divorced plumber. Joy had not returned home since the shooting at the ranch. She said she didn't want to be around Larry because someone was trying to kill him.
Okay.
Then a week or so later, Larry found Joy's Porsche at Parker's plumbing shop. He was waiting there, and 20 minutes later, a car pulled up with Parker and Joy inside of it. And Larry angrily confronted them, then drove away. So he called his attorney, told him to write up another divorce petition. This is the third divorce filing. And this is the final one. This is the one that finally ended the marriage. The divorce went through that August.
So Larry remarried in 1988 to a woman named Jan. Since Rozanne's murder, no more clues had turned up to help solve that crime. The file was put away in the inactive area. Then in late April, Larry called the leading detective on the case. That was Detective McGowan. Larry was really excited and told McGowan that he had some important information about the people who had shot at him at his ranch. He said a woman had called him and he had taped her call. She'd said to him that she understood a friend of his was murdered, and the answer to the riddle was why. So Larry convinced this woman to call McGowan. She did, and she told him that she was interested in the $25,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Rozanne's killer. And she just wanted to know if she was going to get the money if she told police what she knew. But they weren't going to give her an answer that quickly or that easily.
Sure. When she arrived at McGowan's office, the woman's name was Carol Garland. Now, you might have heard that name before. That's Joy's sister. Can you believe that?
Yeah.
This is where it starts getting kind of weird for me.
This is a really twisted family situation.
So, and Carol told McGowan this really confusing story. And there was blackmail, secret marriage, affairs, and murder plots. Basically, she was telling McGowan that her sister Joy had gotten her involved in a plot to have Larry killed. Once she was involved, she also learned that Joy had been the mastermind behind the murder of Rozanne Gailiunas. And also, she said Joy had a list of 5 names on a new hit list, and Carol's name was one of them.
If Carol's correct, Joy wants to just knock people off left and right, basically.
Yeah.
So for the first time since October of 1983, McGowan felt like maybe he could solve Rozanne's murder. He had not thought about Joy too much as a suspect, even though Dr. Peter Gailiunas had said her name on the night of the murder. Joy's alibi for that day had been verified. Also, she had passed a polygraph test. But maybe she didn't register as deceptive because she didn't know all the details. Maybe she had hired someone to kill Rozanne, just as she had hired someone to shoot her husband Larry.
Or maybe she's a sociopath who can lie and get away with it on a polygraph.
That's another good point, Dickie, yes. We've heard of that happening. So Carol told the detective that Joy had been colluding with her estranged husband, Bill Garland. That's Carol's estranged husband. And she had filed assault charges against him, and she was afraid and angry at both Bill Garland and at Joy. Now also she was broke, so this $25,000 was a big incentive. Which just makes me shake my head. Her parents had millions of dollars. But that's how it is in some families. They don't share money from generation to generation. And I guess that's how this was.
And Carol was the one when they were growing up that Joy felt was favored by her parents.
Right, but then she'd had some mental health issues, and maybe she'd fallen down the ranks a little bit.
Quite possible. So according to Carol, Joy began calling her in January of 1986, and she told her that she wanted Larry killed. She said she found out Larry had been having an affair with their younger sister, Elizabeth. Wow.
Yeah, there's 3 sisters, and apparently Larry had a years-long off-and-on affair with the youngest sister, Elizabeth.
Then Joy had told her about Rozanne's murder. Carol told McGowan she would wear a wire and she could get Joy to talk about the murder of Rozanne and the attempted murder of Larry. So Carol got Joy to meet her at a crowded restaurant. She carried a briefcase with her that had a tape recorder inside. They talked for over an hour, and Carol felt really happy that Joy had told her enough for her to be arrested. But once back at the police station, McGowan found the tape impossible to make out due to all the background noise. So it turns out this is all for nothing.
Yeah.
And if they wanted this testimony or this on recording, she's going to have to go back and try it again.
Well, and that could be difficult, right? Because Joy's not an idiot.
No, I mean, you can maybe fool her once, but probably not twice.
But she kind of did, because she met with Joy a few days later, and this time they were in a cheap motel room, and I guess the police had set up some recording equipment. Carol explained that she was hiding from her estranged husband, Bill Garland, and Joy was suspicious this time. But Carol convinced her by telling her that Bill Garland was unhappy with her because she had him arrested for assault. And also she said she had a tape which implicated Garland in plots to kill Rozanne and then Larry. She said that the tape was in a safe deposit box. So Garland would be coming after her, Carol said, and she was worried. So Carol and Joy spoke for over 2 hours, and this time there was definitely enough recorded to arrest Joy. But before Joy was arrested, McGowan had Larry come in, and he told him what was going on. Larry was shocked to learn that his wife had been behind Rozanne's murder and also the shooting attempt to take his life.
I'll bet surprised is an understatement.
Yeah, I mean, he knew that Joy wasn't perfect, but I don't think he had any idea she was capable of this kind of thing.
No.
And the motive is just questionable. It just seems like it's just anger and jealousy and greed.
That's all it seems.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So the police knew that Joy didn't actually commit the murder and attempted murder herself. The investigators went out to interrogate the middlemen and to work their way to finding the actual killer and shooter. So it ends up that Brian Lee Kriefel, the owner of an auto repair shop, and Joseph Walter Thomas, a contractor from Oklahoma, were charged with soliciting the murder and of conspiring to murder Larry.
Well, Joy was believed to set in motion 2 plots that resulted in 2 contracts to kill. First, Joy had gone to a handyman, and she asked him if he knew anyone who could scare Larry for her. Then, after speaking to Kriefel, McGowan gave him the name George Anderson Hopper. Then, after speaking to Kriefel, McGowan had a name, George Anderson Hopper, and Hopper was a car appraiser for a local Chevy dealer. 2 investigators drove to that dealership to talk to Hopper. Hopper seemed very polite and clean-cut. The interview was friendly, until the topic turned to Rozanne Gailiunas. Hopper then became nervous and said he wanted an attorney before talking anymore. But they never had a chance to speak with him because a few weeks later, he disappeared. So that made him look guilty.
George Anderson Hopper was known to everyone as Andy. He was known to be happy and well-liked. He had grown up in a strict Christian home and attended services on Sundays and Wednesdays. He went to Southwest Bible College in North Central Texas, planning to become a minister. Now, in 1975, Andy had married his girlfriend Becky. They moved to Dallas for several months, then on to Houston. And that's where Andy had been offered a job as an appraiser for an auto dealership. He was competent, reliable, and by the time he was 21, he was the youngest manager of an auto dealer in the state of Texas. While he was thought of as a hard-working, faithful person, he had a dark side, which was beginning to surface.
Yeah, so I think he was pretty creepy, actually. In 1976, Andy had been caught publicly masturbating in front of a strange woman at an apartment complex. This was a Class C misdemeanor, and he was just fined $102. Can you believe that? Don't you think there should have been more to that?
Well, I don't know. And it's 40 years ago.
Yeah, but that would be upsetting.
Oh, to say the
It's
least.
scary. And then things got worse when Andy discovered drugs, and he and Becky began to use crystal meth. When they started having trouble making ends meet, they worked out a deal with a drug dealer to sell some marijuana, and eventually Andy and Becky were dealing 10 to 15 pounds a week. Then they separated. Then, when Andy found himself in serious financial trouble, he accepted an envelope from the body shop owner, Brian Kriefel. It was mid-September 1983 when Andy was approached by this guy, and he was given $750 in cash with the promise of another $750 after killing Rozanne Gailiunas.
Yeah, so for several days, Andy considered the murder contract. He talked it over with an old friend who told him it wasn't enough money, and if he went through with it, he was stupid and would be caught. Jeez, great advice. But
Well,
Andy didn't...
kind of.
Well...
I mean, it should be more of an ethical decision, but it still is stupid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is stupid. But his reasoning for stupidity is that it wasn't
The money
paying
amount,
enough.
yeah. I know, that's correct.
But Andy didn't forget about it, and he didn't return the envelope. So it looked like he was seriously considering committing a murder for $1,500.
So he just must have not been thinking clearly. He must have been on drugs. Because that is such a paltry amount of money for such a heinous crime.
Yes, it is.
But he kept thinking about it. He must have been really desperate for money. And one day he decided to drive to Rozanne's address and just check the place out. After a few minutes there, though, he got nervous and drove away. But he still didn't forget about it. Then he dipped into the envelope and used some of the money to buy some crystal meth. So I guess in his mind, he now had the problem that he couldn't repay that money he'd spent, and he decided, well, I'm just going to have to go through with killing that woman. Which is strange.
Just a well-thought-out plan, huh?
Yeah, just really odd. Makes you think that maybe he wasn't thinking about it so much. Maybe he was more of a violent person than he was letting on.
Well, yeah, you want to present yourself in the best light possible.
Sure.
So later that September, Andy went back to Rozanne's house. He parked down the street and walked up to the house. It was dark. He felt bold. He had brought a suction cup and a glass cutter with him. So he walked into the backyard, up to the back door. When he started to cut the glass, it shattered. The window shattered. It sounded loud, so he took off.
Well, yeah, I guess he kind of scared himself. It didn't work like he thought it would, like it did in the movies.
No.
So he stayed away for a few days after that, until Tuesday, October 4th, 1983. He had a car to appraise in a neighborhood near Rozanne's house, he said, so he decided to go by her house again. This time, he saw her car in the driveway. So he said he drove to the condo of a friend of his. He had a key to that place, so he went inside and took a pistol. He grabbed some extra bullets as well and pocketed the gun and the ammunition. Then he drove to a supermarket where he bought some yellow latex gloves and some rope. Then he bought a potted plant at a florist shop nearby. So before he drove to Rozanne's, he also stole license plates from a parked car and put them on his own car. So Andy had made up his mind, and he didn't seem to have a conscience telling him to stop. He parked down the street, walked to the house, carrying the potted plant. The gloves, gun, and rope and ammo were in his pockets. Once at the house, he rang the doorbell, and Rozanne answered in her robe. She was very pretty with her dark hair lying loosely around her face, and she smiled at him, seeing the plant in his hand. So I guess she thought he was a delivery man.
Yeah, but Andy acted quickly. He moved the plant to his other hand, pointed the gun at her, and went in. Her expression was confused and then horrified. He asked her where the bedroom was, and Rozanne began to cry. She asked him why he was doing this to her. He said, "Shut up," pushed her down the hall toward the bedroom. They walked past little Peter's room and saw him sleeping. Andy closed the door. Then he ordered Rozanne to remove her robe. She begged him not to hurt her, but he told her to get on the bed face down. So despite what must have been a high level of panic, it didn't move Andy.
No, he tied her wrists and ankles to the 4 posts of the bed. Then he kneeled on the bed behind her and attempted to rape her. But apparently he ejaculated prematurely and then went into the bathroom to wash. Then he returned to the bedroom and saw that Rozanne was trying to free herself. So Andy took a stocking from a nearby chair and twisted it around Rozanne's throat. It had too much give, so he took her robe sash and strangled her with it. Rozanne was able to free her left hand, and she began swinging at him. So she put up a fight, but she really didn't have much of a chance.
No, she didn't. So at this point, Andy removed the gun from his pocket and fired twice into her head through a pillow. Her body jerked, and then she was still. And to make sure she was dead, he stuffed some tissue down her throat. Later, he would deny putting any tissue into her mouth or throat. Well, somebody did, because the paramedics pulled a bunch out.
Yes.
Andy ran out the door, peeked in beforehand to see that little Peter was still asleep. He walked to his car and drove away. On the way home, he stopped at a do-it-yourself car wash and vacuumed the interior. He removed the license plates, the stolen plates, and put his own back on. And then he tossed the stolen plates into a trash can. He shredded the information he'd been given about Rozanne and threw that away also. Then he left.
So when Andy went back to the body shop owner who had given him that envelope with Rozanne's information and the $750, he learned that Rozanne hadn't died until 2 days after she was attacked. So, in just this weird sequence of events, she had actually died on Andy's 28th birthday. But Andy's personality changed after that murder. Becky noticed it, and she was actually concerned. He didn't tell her about the crime, but his mood was disturbing to her. On October 12th, Becky left him. She had decided that the relationship was over, but then after some time he was able to convince her to come back to him, and she agreed with the stipulation that he had to see a marriage counselor. So Becky returned to Andy on Christmas Day, 1983. They were still in financial trouble, but Andy gave up his own business and took a steady-paying job. He kept his promise to Becky about seeing a counselor, and for a while he became a more attentive husband and a more devoted father to their 2 young daughters. But it didn't take long for Andy to fall back into his old patterns.
Yeah, he started using drugs again, and he had affairs with some other women. So just 5 months after he had reconciled with Becky, he was in trouble with the law. In May 1984, a man accused Andy of stealing his wallet and trying to extort more money from him. Andy had threatened the lives of the man's family and told him to leave money at certain drop points. So when Andy went to pick up the money, police were waiting for him. He escaped for a while, but police went to his house and arrested him in front of his family. Becky bailed him out, so she still got something for him.
She's kind of an enabler, although I can see, she does have a family with him.
Sure.
So it was July of 1988 when investigators showed up at Andy's job and asked him about Rozanne. He felt like he got through the questioning okay, but then he told his boss that he would have to go away for a few days to take care of some personal things. He said that the police were trying to put something on him that he didn't do, and he needed some time to take care of it. And his boss was okay with that because he was a good, reliable worker for the most part. But after leaving the dealership that evening, Andy went home and he made an appointment with a lawyer. But the lawyer wanted a very large retainer and Andy didn't have the money. So he found a friend who would loan it to him, and he told Becky that the police were trying to put something on him, so he needed to hire a lawyer. She was really surprisingly supportive, but she could see Andy was feeling very concerned and depressed, and she was worried when she learned that he had borrowed a pistol from a friend. There is something to really be concerning.
You think, huh?
Because he's done some petty crimes, some drug deals, but the violence is a new thing, at least that she knows about. First she'd heard of it.
Yep. So on August 1st, Becky asked Andy to drop their daughter at cheerleading practice while he was going to work. But he hadn't shaved yet, so Becky said, "Never mind, I'll take care of it." Before Becky and her daughters got into the car that morning, Andy hugged them all and said, "No matter what happens, always remember that I love you."
So that just kind of haunts me because it's so similar to Rozanne's last words to Larry on the day she died.
I know.
Yeah. But she shouldn't have known anything horrible was going to happen to her. You just wonder, did she have a feeling? Was she worried? She did feel like she was being stalked. She thought it was her ex-husband, but, who knows at that point?
Well, I think she knew something was going on, right?
I think so. And she couldn't have imagined what happened to her, obviously, but I think she was a little nervous. But as soon as his family had left, Andy packed a suitcase and drove to a friend's house. He asked that friend to drive him out of the city so he could get away, and she drove him into Oklahoma, a few hours out of Dallas, and then left him on a quiet street.
Then a few weeks later, Andy was located in Idaho. Detective McGowan got permission to fly there and to try to get Andy to talk, because he had a strong hunch Andy had somehow been involved in Rozanne's murder. So he flew to Idaho with an ex-lover of Andy's. She told Andy that she would come for a visit.
Yes, they had tried to set this up in a pretty clever way. McGowan had a motel room prepared with some recording equipment, but then Andy took his lover to a different motel. The next day, though, she was able to convince Andy to switch motels, so they were in the room with the recording equipment, and it worked well. But the problem was that Andy wouldn't discuss the murder with her. So he took off on his motorcycle, probably knowing something was up there, right? And he headed toward the Canadian border. So he knows the detectives are on to him.
Yeah. But McGowan was able to pick up two brothers in Dallas who had been involved in the attempted murder of Larry Aylor. Joy's middleman had apparently approached Andy first, but he didn't have any interest in killing anyone else besides the one that he'd already done.
Yeah, and I don't know if that was because he felt guilty or if he just felt like he didn't want to get caught. I'm not sure. But Bill Garland, the middleman, Carol's ex-husband, had approached a guy named Buster Matthews and his brother. And they were going to be paid $5,000, $2,500 up front, and the other $2,500 after Larry was killed. So their plan was this. The target would be lured to a rural area where they would ambush him from the nearby woods. So that was the day that Larry went to saddle up the horses at his ranch. It was June 16th.
So that would make Joy a conspirator in this.
Oh, yeah, she planned both of the murders.
Because she called. I know, but we haven't gotten around to really suspecting her much.
Right, except Carol knows. If it weren't for Carol.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, on June 16th, the Matthews brothers hid in the trees, and they waited for Larry to show up at the ranch. And Larry did walk into their trap, but the men were just horrible marksmen and didn't get him. All they got was his friend's elbow. And later it was determined that these men had fired 10 to 12 shots from 80 to 100 feet away. But only 3 hit the truck, and 1 hit Larry's friend in his elbow. So the 2 men fled to rural New Mexico that August. And in late August, the 2 got a ride from a Good Samaritan. But they robbed the Good Samaritan. They left him tied up on the side of the road and took off with his truck. So these guys are kind of like dumb criminals.
Oh, well, yeah. And the police came by, or a sheriff's deputy, and the truck owner's explaining what had happened, and he sees his truck driving down the road. These idiots had gone the wrong way, so they turned around and were going the other way.
Yeah, going back by him again.
Jeez.
Yeah, so they weren't too tough to catch. Within minutes, the deputy had pulled them over in the stolen truck, and then they tried to run off, but they were caught and put in jail. They were charged with stealing the truck, armed robbery, and false imprisonment for what they'd done to the Good Samaritan.
And then Andy turned up again in mid-December. He got himself arrested at a friend's house in Dallas. He refused to talk about the crimes when detectives interrogated him. He was kept in jail, and on February 12, 1989, he did give a formal statement, which would later become known as the Chip Statement.
Yes. So Andy admitted to accepting an envelope with money and Rozanne's information from Brian Kriefel. And in late September, he said he went to Rozanne's house with the plan to kill her. But he said that he broke the window and walked into the kitchen, taking a steak knife from a block on the counter. Then he waited for her to return home. But in this story, Andy said he began to worry that she might return with someone else with her. And if she showed up with a man, he didn't want to get into a fight. So within a couple of days, he had changed his mind. So he left, decided not to do it, kept $500 of the money, but returned everything else to a man who had sold drugs to him before. And he said all he knew about that guy was that his name was Chip.
Uh-huh.
And there was a Chip, but he was not involved.
Well, a few days later, Andy said he ran into Chip, and Chip told him everything had been taken care of, then warned him that if he ever talked, he would kill Andy's family.
It's just a bunch of nice people.
This sounds like, yeah.
Well, it does sound like bullshit, too.
So Andy's defense attorney, Jan Hemphill, agreed to have him take a polygraph. But he didn't do well. He showed deception in his responses to 3 critical questions. Were you in the house with Rozanne when she was attacked? Do you know who murdered Rozanne? Did you murder Rozanne?
So those are some pretty important questions. Those aren't just incidental.
No, they aren't.
But after the test, detectives should have returned Andy to his jail cell. And if they wanted to talk to him more after that, they should have called Jan Hemphill and made arrangements. But instead, Detective McGowan read him his Miranda rights and questioned him without his attorney. And this would become an issue later on at trial and with appeals.
Yeah, well, I think that's a no-no.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like the right thing to do. So McGowan had actually found Chip, and he showed Andy a photo of the guy. And Andy was pretty shocked that he had actually gone out and found him. Now, McGowan said he hadn't spoken with Chip yet, but he asked Andy what he thought would happen if they gave Chip a polygraph. And Andy said, well, if Chip passed, then the crime would come back to me. So he was very defeated at this point, and McGowan was able to get him to confess to killing Rozanne.
Huh?
He explained how he had bought a potted plant and posed as a floral delivery man. And when McGowan looked over the crime scene photos, he actually saw the plant. It was just a few feet in from the front door in Rozanne's house. So Andy was returned to the Dallas County Jail later that afternoon.
Yeah, but as you said, there were some issues with the way the confession was obtained, and they're going to come up at a trial. One issue was that the interrogation had been done without Andy's attorney. Another issue was that Andy had twice asked to go back to his cell and think about it. A prisoner has the right to end an interview at any time, so the question was whether his asking to go back and think about it counted as a request to end the interview. The third problem was whether Andy's own lawyer had acted ineffectively by allowing him to be polygraphed without her being present.
I would say, hell yeah.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. So Joy, Bill Garland, Kriefel, and Andy were all indicted. And in November, Joy's sister Carol was indicted by a grand jury for soliciting her former brother-in-law's murder and conspiring to kill Larry. So being indicted when she thought she was going to collect $25,000 really surprised and outraged Carol.
She's going to go in and get $25,000 and she's arrested.
Got herself in trouble. And Garland and Kriefel each would end up with a sentence of 30 years in prison for their part. So once Joy and Larry divorced in August of 1986, their son Chris was again living with his grandparents. That Christmas, he was given a late-model Corvette. And at 1:30 a.m., the morning after Christmas, Chris and his friend Raymond Slupecki Jr. were killed in an automobile accident. So Chris was only 19 years old. This was a real tragedy. And then there was another weird thing about this. Now, it's not really related to the murders, but it's bizarre, isn't it?
It sure is.
Within a couple hours of the accident, a friend of both Chris and Slupecki drove to a park near his home and killed himself.
Yikes.
Yeah, so the series of tragic events was shocking and really disturbed the entire community, not to mention the parents of these boys. After Chris died, Larry wondered if maybe his son had changed, though, because there were a lot of rumors of cocaine use, and then Larry found several guns in Chris's room. So I don't know
something was up.
Yeah, what was with the grandparents? Were they buying him guns? Was he involved in selling drugs? We don't know. But as far as the accident goes, it seems like the boys were drag racing.
Yeah. Joy pretty much fell apart after the sudden death of her only child. Up until his death, she and Larry had continued to fight over Chris. And even after his death, they had to argue about where he would be buried.
Well, yeah, I guess her parents wanted him buried on their family's land, but Larry knew he'd never be able to visit there.
Right. He wouldn't be. So 3 weeks later, a judge ruled for Larry that Chris would be buried in a Dallas cemetery.
But Joy's trauma and her depression were definitely worsened by her legal issues, which were pretty severe. The DA ruled that Joy Aylor and Andy Hopper would be tried separately on charges for Rozanne's murder. Andy was in jail, but Joy was able to buy herself out on a $140,000 bond. Which just doesn't seem fair. Right? I mean, she's just as guilty to me.
The way it's described, yeah, she's just as guilty.
And Andy never would have been in that house if it weren't for Joy, so she's almost more responsible. But, you know, it's like if you have some money. Also, there's always the factor of being a woman. A well-off white woman. I just think it's not always fair.
Oh, nobody said it was.
Although I certainly think Andy should have been in jail, but I think Joy should have also.
Yeah, no question. So Joy's thinking ahead. She begins to save up money because she's thinking she's going to flee.
Well, she thought she might have to, depending on how it went.
Yeah. She took money from her accounts in small, frequent withdrawals in order that the banks wouldn't report it to federal authorities. But early May, when she went to court for what she thought would be a routine bond hearing, she learned that her trial would begin, with jury selection in just 10 days, and there was a pretrial hearing coming up. So she panicked. She ran to her money, she ran to her attorney, who was now also her lover, and said, "Let's get out of here." Now this guy, one of the best attorneys in the state, probably.
Yeah.
He had his own legal problems, so he said, "Good idea." So that's next Saturday, May 5th, Joy and her attorney fled with some help from one of her cousins. They headed west in the cousin's vehicle. Joy had an Amex card in a false name and a bag filled with $300,000 in cash. Well, that ought to get you a little bit of ways away.
Oh, yeah. I mean, she got away for a while.
Yep.
Investigators learned that Joy had the help of several friends and family members. They helped her put together this large amount of cash. According to Brad Davis, he drove the couple to Cheyenne, Wyoming, leaving them at a Jeep dealership. And Joy spent $7,800 there on a 1984 Wagoneer. And Brad was the cousin. So from Cheyenne, they drove to Montana, staying at the Blackfoot Indian Reservation just long enough to buy some clothes and register the Jeep. Then they headed for Vancouver, Canada. So Joy's attorney decided to return to Dallas and turn himself in. But Joy decided she was going to go to Mexico because she's looking at a lot more time than he was. He wasn't wanted for murder. So on June 7th, Joy took a Japan Airlines flight from Vancouver to Mexico City. Now, her attorney lover was captured in British Columbia living in a motel, but he was kind of relieved to be caught.
Yeah, I guess this life on the run wasn't suiting him.
Oh, I just can't imagine that it's any fun.
Huh. No kidding. Now, in August of 1990, 2 months after she had left Vancouver, 2 months after Joy had left Vancouver, a Dallas woman called the police to report that she had been taking Spanish classes with Joy Aylor while she was in Cuernavaca, Mexico. Joy was living under the name Jody Packer. This Jody had told the woman that she and her husband were having problems, and she was going to meet him in Mexico City to try and fix the marriage. And after she was gone, the woman discovered that her Mexican travel visa had been stolen, likely by Joy. And then when she saw Joy's picture in a Dallas paper, she called the police.
Yes, so that September of 1990, Joy's case was on America's Most Wanted. It led to a lot of tips, but nothing that panned out. By that time, Joy had been missing for 5 months. And then it turned out that Jody Packer, the plumber and lover, was helping Joy out. In July of 1990, he'd gone to a Dallas post office and applied for a passport using fraudulent documents in the name of his uncle Donald Earhart. The real uncle had been killed in a hunting accident 25 years earlier. Then, in Oklahoma, someone applied for a passport in the name of Elizabeth Sharp, a Dallas woman about Joy's age who had died just months earlier. But all of this was learned after the fact.
Yeah, after leaving Mexico, Joy traveled through Central America and South America, Germany, and France. In December, she rented a villa in a small village near Nice and Cannes. Her apartment was a 1-bedroom, 1-bath overlooking the Venice Hills, and they had beautiful gardens maintained by her landlord. She paid about $700 a month for the place.
Well, Joy had introduced herself to her landlord as Elizabeth Sharp. She said she had 2 sons in college and a husband who was traveling Europe. But at the same time, Jody Packer was traveling under the name of his late uncle, Donald Earhart, and he was visiting Joy in France. What he was doing is he was telling friends back home that he had business in the Middle East, so he would be gone quite a bit. But actually, he was going to see Joy. So he just was in love with her for a very long time and would pretty much do anything she wanted. And what she was doing at this point was building herself a new life in France. She cut her dark hair and added blonde highlights, and she began wearing expensive clothing and jewelry from Paris. But Joy had become paranoid. She had this feeling of imminent doom during the Gulf War and expressed fear of biological warfare. I mean, to the point where she sealed her windows, doors, and vents with newspaper and tape. So she's becoming kind of a crazy person. Now, she had been a meticulous housekeeper, but in this place she was just letting trash and dust pile up all over her home. Then after the U.S. began bombing in Iraq, Joy stopped leaving her home, and her connections to the outside world began to shrink. In March of 1991, when her lease was up, Joy rented a new apartment nearby, and she had rented a small car. On one of her rare trips, she had a minor accident, and she panicked and left the car on the side of the road. But the French police became suspicious when they discovered that car. They did a background check on Elizabeth Sharp, who had rented it. And that's when they figured out that Sharp was actually Joy Aylor, a woman wanted for murder in Texas. So that's how she got herself found out.
There she goes. So on March 16th, the police knocked on Joy's door. They asked her to come with them to the police station so that they could clear up the issue of the damaged rental car. And she agreed to this. But when she got to the station, Joy learned that she had been found out. So she asked to use the bathroom, and while in the bathroom, she slashed her wrists with a razor she had brought in with her.
So she must have thought it was a little suspicious if she brought the razor.
Well, she must have known something was up, right?
Yeah, she must have thought, well, I better bring that in case I have to do myself in.
Yeah, but the injuries weren't life-threatening. Then back at her apartment, police found several credit cards in various names and a bag of cash from several countries. While she had been on the run, Joy had gone by the names Mrs. John Storms, Jody Packer, Lee Curry, Stephanie Grimes, and Elizabeth Sharp.
Yeah, but the real Jody Packer, the guy, plumber, returned to Dallas in late March. Then in April, he was arrested and charged with passport fraud. They found him with $9,500 in traveler's checks and some airline tickets to Costa Rica and Mexico City. So, for some reason, they let him out on bond, but he didn't show up for his court date.
Well, that's a big surprise. He's got tickets, he's got traveler's checks. You have to think he's a risk to flee.
Yeah, and he has access to money, right?
Yeah.
So he really shouldn't have been let out, but he was marked as a fugitive, and then he was indicted by a grand jury, even though he wasn't there. He actually lived on a yacht in the Bahamas for a long time, as he was the subject of searches by government agencies for about 3 years. And then he was finally arrested on May 5th of 1994 while he was attempting to re-enter the U.S. from Mexico. So that was kind of a stupid decision unless he wanted to get caught.
Maybe he was looking to get caught.
Might have, because he really didn't have anything to do with the murder, so he wasn't looking at a huge amount of time.
Yeah, and he did accept a plea agreement under which he pled guilty to 7 counts of the superseding indictment returned by the grand jury for the Eastern District of Texas. Specifically, concealing a person from arrest, conspiracy to commit passport fraud, use of a fraudulent Social Security number, mail fraud, and failure to appear. The court sentenced Packer to 27 months on the group charges, with a consecutive 16-month sentence on the failure to appear charge, and a fine was imposed.
So not too horrible.
No.
Considering.
I think it's pretty nice.
And then Joy was returned to the U.S. after the district attorney agreed that he wouldn't seek the death penalty against Joy, because France wouldn't send her over if she could be put to death.
Right.
And remember those goofy brothers that stole the truck and got caught after they shot at Larry and missed? Those Matthew brothers were tried separately on charges of conspiring to murder Larry. And they were both convicted and got life in prison, so how stupid is that? They threw their lives away.
I know. And Andy Hopper, who actually committed the murder of Rozanne Gailiunas, was being tried with a possible sentence of the death penalty. In his capital murder trial, the jury would determine his guilt or innocence. Then, if he was found guilty, the jury would decide if he would serve life in prison or be put to death by lethal injection. In March 1992, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to die by lethal injection, and actually was put to death in March of 2005.
It took 13 years.
Well, it takes a while, right?
Yeah.
By the time you exhaust all your appeals and everything.
Yeah, I really don't believe in the death penalty, but Texas liked to do that. When Andy was asked if he had a final statement, he turned toward 4 of Rozanne's family members and told them he was sorry. Then he turned to another window where his parents were and thanked them for everything. Then he said a short prayer with his mother. So my heart breaks for that mother.
Yeah, no kidding.
What a position to be in.
Now, following her trial, Joy Aylor was sentenced to life in prison with eligibility for parole. Her first parole hearing was in March 2011, and it was denied. She remains incarcerated at the Mountain View Women's Prison in Gatesville, Texas, and is eligible for parole again in December of 2022.
Yeah, so it really doesn't seem fair that he got the death penalty and she didn't, although I can see why, because otherwise they wouldn't have been able to bring her back to the U.S. But I really think, considering that, they're not going to let her out of prison. Of course, December 2022, she'll be in her 70s, so she'll have been in prison a long time. So I have a little confusion in my mind about this, and maybe you can help me work it out. Who told little Peter to hang up the phone when Larry called Rozanne's house the day of the murder? Remember? Larry called, little Peter answered, and he heard a man's voice say, hang up the damn phone.
Right. And he couldn't identify the voice. Just that it was a male voice.
Right. So were the police already there and they did it? It was 6:15 when little Peter called his father, and he said his mom was sick and he couldn't wake her. And less than 30 minutes later was when Larry called the house. When Larry called, little Peter told him his mom was sick.
So you have 6:15 calling his father. Mom's sick.
Right.
And then 30 minutes later.
About. We don't know exactly.
Larry called. He was told Mom was sick, and the voice in the background said, hang up the phone.
Well, yeah, so I guess it was a paramedic or a policeman? Because the paramedics were there at 6:36. You know, they keep track of that. Unless Larry was wrong about the time and her husband Peter was there. Because we have the issue of Roxanne having 0.22 milligrams per liter of Thorazine in her blood when she arrived at the ER. So there were questions if maybe Peter injected her with it. Also remember that Andy said he didn't put the tissues down her throat. Could Peter have run over there and done that to make sure she died?
Well, I think that's a possibility.
Yeah, it's kind of a long shot, though.
It is, but, I mean, how else would she have the Thorazine in her system?
Yeah, that's a strange one.
The paramedics weren't going to do that.
Well, no, I mean, what does Thorazine do, generally?
Well, it's an antipsychotic, right?
Uh-huh.
And it will sedate you a little bit. So if Big Peter gets over there and finds her mortally wounded, I guess you could say he had the opportunity to inject the Thorazine, but then why do that?
It's a little weird.
Yeah.
It's really kind of a stretch, but, why would a paramedic or a policeman say, hang up the goddamn phone? I think if a call came in, I would think a policeman or a paramedic would answer it or try and keep them on the phone.
Yeah, right?
Well, at least a policeman would, maybe not a paramedic, because they're focused on just trying to save her.
Yeah.
It's just a little bit of a mystery to me, a little bit confused about what was going on there. I mean, a pathologist for the defense in Andy Hopper's trial suggested that Peter could have given it to Rozanne to speed up her death. And also there's the tissues, but little Peter did say the first time that his father was there.
Yeah, and then he changed when he was asked a second time, he said nobody.
So it's a little hinky.
It is. I think he could have been there. Although I'm not sure why he would think of injecting Thorazine.
Yeah, why Thorazine of all things?
I know.
And is that something a nephrologist would even have handy?
No.
Wouldn't think so. So where the hell did that come from? That's just such a mystery.
It's a good, interesting story.
I just wonder if that's something that you could have in your body from some other thing. Of course, they didn't give it to her at the hospital. Why would they give her that?
No.
So, you're not going to help me out here.
I did all I could. I said there's a possibility that the husband had been there.
Yeah, I think so. It is possible. Okay. Well, just a fascinating story.
Very.
So our sources for this case are the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, Lake Highlands Advocate Archives, D Magazine article from July 1991 titled Fatal Obsessions, written by Glenna Whitley. There are 2 books, which I read all of one and part of another. One is Open Secrets, A True Story of Love, Jealousy, and Murder, written by Carlton Stowers. And the other one is To Hatred Turned by Ken Englade. So plenty of sources out there, a lot to read about with this case, obviously.
That was very fascinating.
There's also a Snapped episode, but I didn't find it very helpful, so I wouldn't really call it a source. TCB's music was written and produced by Tristan Capel. If you enjoy listening to TCB, please consider leaving us a review on iTunes or wherever it is you listen. That really helps us to get our name out there and get new listeners. If you visit our website, tiegrabber.com, you'll also find a shopping page where you can buy some brewery merch. We have tees, tanks, and now we have our warm, soft hoodies, our zip-up sweatshirts, which have gotten some really good reviews from listeners. Lots of good stuff. Also masks to keep you safe and declare your TCB love to the public at large. You can also subscribe to our members-only show, True Crime Brewery Premium, on our website. And as a member, you get a new bonus episode each and every month, ad-free versions of our weekly shows, and access to the close to 50, I would guess, bonus episodes that are there now. And of course, I send everyone a gift with a handwritten thank you note. Also, maybe the best part, once you're a member, you don't have to listen to me say this stuff anymore.
Okay. So I do have some feedback for you today, Jill.
All right, what you got?
Actually, I have 2 voicemails today because they were so good I wanted to put them in, both of them. So 2 voicemails and 1 email. And the first voicemail is a case suggestion from Allison.
Hello, Jill and Dick. This is Allison from North Carolina. I have a case suggestion for you that's quite a doozy. It is Pam Hupp, H-U-P-P. And she is just something else, let me tell you. She is actually in prison right now, convicted of a 2016 murder of Louis Gumpenberger, but her story is way more complicated than just that. So in 2011, Betsy Faria was murdered. Her husband, Russ Faria, was convicted in 2013, but largely because Pam Hupp testified against him. But in 2015, Russ was actually exonerated of his wife's murder when evidence ended up pointing toward Hupp as the murderer. Apparently, Betsy had made Hupp the sole beneficiary of her life insurance policy without telling anyone. And Pam Hupp was supposed to give that money to Betsy's children, but never did and kept it for herself. So Russ got out of prison, and Pam Hupp is a suspect now in Betsy Faria's murder. And that kind of all goes into this murder of Louis Gumpenberger. Apparently the motive of his murder was Hupp was trying to set up Russ Faria as if it was a murder for hire plot to kill Pam. So it's very twisting. It's a twisted story with lots of turns, and man, this woman is evil. There's also, I guess, a question as if she had something to do with her mother's murder or her mother's death in 2013. I guess they don't know if it was a murder or not. It's just, there's questions there. So this woman, obviously something wrong with her. Glad she's in prison. But I really hope you guys will look into her case and look into these murders and try to unravel her web here. Thank you guys so much for everything you do. I love your podcast. You guys are wonderful. You are my relationship goals. So keep it up.
Well, thanks so much, Allison. And actually, I'm quite familiar with this case.
Yes.
This was on Dateline. There was also a whole podcast series with my friend Keith. And it's called Something About Pam or something like that. So just fascinating that she pre-planned this whole murder of this woman who's supposed to be her best friend. And it's really outrageous how Betsy's husband got convicted because, remember, he was at a game night with friends watching a movie and playing games. He had like 6 friends who could alibi him.
Yeah, they still convicted him.
Yeah. And then she went around looking for some kind of lackey or someone that she could murder. And poor Louis Gumpenberger ended up being the guy. She was pretending to be a Dateline producer. You remember this?
Yes.
So this is
that's why I liked this case suggestion.
Great case suggestion, and I don't know how long it'll take us to get around to it. I think we're planned into December at this point, but definitely a case that I would love to do.
Yeah, and also when Allison mentioned that there were some questions about her mother's death.
Yes.
Remember these?
I remember that.
A fall from a balcony or something?
Yes, like not to laugh at this poor woman's death, but it was just so contrived that the railing on her mother's patio was broken in a weird way. And what do? Push your mother off a balcony?
Yeah.
This woman has no scruples at all. Evil. Because she had really befriended Betsy.
Yeah, she had.
Yeah, so
you like that suggestion?
I like that suggestion. That's something that we would really enjoy doing, yeah.
Then we have another voicemail from Patricia with a case suggestion.
Hi, Dick and Jill. It is Thursday, October the 15th. This is Patricia from Canada, from Toronto. Longtime listener and subscriber. Love your podcasts. Just had an interesting case come up. It's kind of breaking news here. It is the murder of Christine Jessup in Ontario, Canada, Toronto kind of area, Ontario, Canada. Her spelling of her name is Christine. Last name Jessup, Jessop. She was 9 years old, 36 years ago, when she was stabbed to death and raped. I was fairly young at the time, kind of early, maybe 10, 11, 12, and I remember the case very well. There's a lot of complications with it. They just found the identity of her killer through genealogical DNA. I think it would be an excellent one for you to look into. There's a lot of twists and turns to it, and maybe some resolution. At any rate, thanks so much for everything. I really appreciate your podcasts in this insane world we're living in.
Thank you so much, Patricia. This case, what do you think, Dickie? I've never heard of this one.
No, this is another one. I mean, the genetics and the genealogic stuff is really coming to the forefront. And this is another one. The man who was convicted of the crime is named Guy Paul Morin. He was convicted, but was exonerated in 1995 by DNA analysis. It wasn't his DNA that was at the scene. And I believe he was the first person to be exonerated by DNA.
Interesting.
And then the big interesting thing is, as Patricia said, recently is like this month of October 2020, they used DNA genealogic techniques and they determined a guy named Calvin Hooper to be the murderer. So this is hot off the press.
Yeah, we've had suggestions for a few of these cases where DNA is involved.
Yeah, well, it's going to be more and more heard of.
I think so. I think we should probably interview a couple of experts on this and then start taking on some cases. I'd like to have a little more knowledge before I jump into that.
Yeah, what's that genetics show we've seen on TV? Where
The Genetic Detective, I think?
Yeah.
There's been a few episodes
But we've
of that.
only seen a couple.
Yes, but they did cover Angie Dodge, which is a case we're doing soon.
Yes.
Yep. Another one that was covered by our friend Keith. Okay.
All right, we have an email from Heidi, and she has a case suggestion. Now, you're familiar with this stuff, so I'll read that, and then you can highlight stuff.
Okie doke.
Hey, guys, just tried my first Russian Imperial Stout. Yay, good for you, Heidi. Never would have ordered one, but I was very curious because I've been listening to Dick's beer reviews for years. It was great. I really tasted the coffee, dark chocolate, and black cherries that was in it. I can't wait to try another when I go to another area of our state. Atta girl.
All right. Your first Russian Imperial Stout. You'll never forget it.
It's a big step.
It is.
I have a case suggestion, and that's John Meehan, CRNA. I worked with him in Warsaw, Indiana. He stole much-needed narcotics. He undermedicated vulnerable surgical patients under general anesthesia, taking the narcotics for himself. You probably know the story very well, because Dirty John was a podcast from Wondery.
Yes, plus there was a TV show.
There was.
Mm-hmm.
So she says it's gotten a lot of publicity. He's a fascinating, intelligent sociopath, and it has a Walking Dead element. I guess that's for you, Jill.
I guess I've mentioned that before. Yes. And that is my favorite part of the show was the Walking Dead comments by the daughter. That was cute.
Right.
Yeah. But yes, it's definitely a case worth covering. It's been in the public for a while now, but maybe if we wait a little while,
Yeah.
we can bring it out again. But yeah, just a crazy case. He wasn't a murderer per se, but he did horrible things, took advantage of people and lied. Lied.
Well, he could have been a murderer.
Certainly. Yeah. And he might have been a murderer, and he did try to murder, right? He was an
Yes.
attempted murderer.
Right.
Yes. But you know, the one thing about this, and I never want to victim blame, but the woman he hooked up with, just how naive she was. Or maybe not naive, maybe I'll be kinder than that. So forgiving. She found out things and she just kept forgiving him.
Yeah.
And then there was the whole family connection of a murder that had happened a generation earlier, and how that family had forgiven someone who murdered one of their sisters and daughters.
Yeah.
So that's definitely part of the case that would be interesting to talk about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's do it sometime next year.
Yep. So thank you, Heidi.
Yeah, good suggestions, guys.
Yeah, and I'm glad you liked your beer. All right, Tiggy. I think we need to wrap things up and let people go. We've been on here a long time.
It's a wrap.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for listening. We hope everyone stays safe and happy. And we'll see you next time at the quiet end.
I got a bar stool waiting for you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.